Welcome to the first talk of 2022 in the Behind the CV series. As Anne already just said a second ago, the idea is to kind of learn about how faculty got to where they are, and like the name suggests, sort of hear things that you wouldn't learn about from looking at their websites or their CVs. So today we're delighted to be joined by Professor Joshua Gold from the Neuroscience department here at Penn. And he's going to tell us about his life story, and then we'll welcome questions from anybody. So if you want, feel free to type them in the chat as we're going along. I can read them off, or you can just wait till the end and raise your hand. But Josh, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Oh, thanks for inviting me. I appreciate it. Well, I've already announced to several of you that my daughter told me quite clearly that there's no way that I could talk about myself and say anything interesting for more than about 5 minutes. I will do my best, but I will probably keep the initial remarks not terribly long, and would be very happy to answer questions and what people want to hear. Let's see, can I share my screen? I have a picture. I have a picture I want to start with.
Yeah, sure. I'll give you sharing capabilities.
Here, it looks like I can. I think
okay.
So. Does that show? All right, Brian can't answer this. What this is and why it matters to me. No one else is going to be able to either. It's also kind of a, like which one of these is not like the other pictures. So I will cut to the chase. So this is the 2002, what is it? The Strategic Advisory Group to the United States Strategic Command, US Stratcom. That's my mom. So my upbringing was maybe not quite the same as what a lot of people. So I really owe so much of who I am to my parents, and so I kind of wanted to start with them. So they met in junior high school as junior high school students in New York City. Their grandparents were immigrants. They were the first two people in both their families to go to college. Both of them went on to get PhDs. I keep telling other people this story. So my oldest daughter is now at St. Andrews. She's a freshman at St. Andrews. And one of the main reasons why she's able to be over there, and us, but I'd say particularly her little sister, is able to handle it, is that the two of them video chat every day. And it's amazing what video technology does. And I like to contrast that. My dad's story, he went to City College for a year, and then he got a scholarship at Rensselaer, which was way far away. It's upstate New York. And they couldn't afford to call each other, like to tell his parents how he was. So they had a system back in the day when you'd make a long distance call, you'd call the operator, and you'd tell them to dial the number. And the operator, whoever answered, would say, X is calling, will you accept the call? And they had a code. So he used one name if everything was okay, and he used a different name if everything was not okay. And if everything was okay, they would just say, no, I won't accept the call. And that was their communication, that he was fine. My parents then graduated, got married, moved out west to California. I'll turn this off. You don't need to see this picture of Stratcom for the whole time. My mom was, we think, we're not 100% sure, but we think she was the second woman to ever get a PhD in math from Berkeley. She was one of the first. My dad was got a PhD in electrical engineering. So I grew up. So he got his degree from Davis. My mom got her degree from Berkeley. If you know California, we lived sort of right between the two. That's where I grew up. It was a great place to grow up, and it was just natural that what happens is your parents went off to work and they had their careers, and your mom did lots of things where there were pictures around the house of her and lots of men. And that picture I showed you was from 2002. And that was after her career had been going on for decades and decades and decades. And so it was very natural for me to sort of think about a career in science, career in technical things. I'd never thought about neuroscience. I didn't know the brain from anything else while I was in high school. When I went off to college, like pretty much everything else I did when I was younger, and it's probably still true now, it was just to follow my sister, who's my best friend and who's the greatest person in the world. And she went off to college, so I went off to the same college. She took a neuroscience course when she was a freshman. I took the same neuroscience course, and it was great. And so I did neuroscience as an undergraduate. Really enjoyed it. It seemed like the natural thing to do was to just continue the research that I was doing as a graduate student. Most of what I did was computational, not experimental. And so when I went off to graduate school, I actually took a detour and did an internship at Apple Computer for a summer, the summer after I graduated undergrad and before I started graduate school. This will shock you. My sister was out there, and her boyfriend at the time worked at Apple and told me about an internship program. And so I joined the internship program. I worked there for the summer. I was about to start graduate school, and the people at Apple said, if you want to keep working here, you keep working here. So I actually deferred graduate school for a while, for another, I can't remember, 4 or 5, 6 months, something like that. Kept working full-time at Apple. When I started grad school at Apple, they said, you can keep working if you want. And so the whole time that I was in grad school, I was working part-time at Apple, which was cool. It was before people cared about things like, oh, you're getting salaries from 2 places and things like that. And every once in a while, my graduate advisor would say, are you still working at Apple? And I handled it very maturely by always answering, and sort of managed. Somehow he never figured out that I was never in lab on Friday, and that's just kind of how it worked. So I got this kind of neat education. So at the time, Apple had a real research group. So it was this was the people call it the interregnum. There was basically a 5-year period when Steve Jobs was not there. He basically got forced out when they had these disasters, including the Next computer. That was exactly the 5 years that I was there. I'm super smart about money, and I can tell you that because when I was there, Apple stock was like 20 cents, and I didn't buy any of it. But it was a great experience. And so they had a real research group, and I was doing real research there. My PhD was on sound localization in barn owls, which was real experiments. And it just worked out by luck that the person I was working with and working for at Apple came out of a neuroscience lab and that mostly focused on kind of auditory modeling. And the project I worked on there was to develop tools to simulate 3D sound sources, which is basically sound localization, the same problem that I was addressing in grad school, but from a very different perspective. And I was sort of lucky that there was some layoffs at various times there, but because I was this funny part-time position, I didn't show up on any org chart, so I never seemed to get laid off, and I would just sort of get passed around to various people, and I managed to stay working there through grad school. And in fact, I enjoyed it more than I enjoyed grad school. The other sort of key point that I would say about me at that time is I really didn't like graduate school, and there were various reasons. I had some health problems. There were other things going on, and if you would have asked me at any point in the last 4 years of my grad school, what was the chance that I would stay in academia? I would say less than 1%. I was completely convinced that it was just wasn't for me. Like it was fine. Like it was a good thing to do, but there was this other path that I could do. And then right before I graduated, Steve Jobs came back to Apple, and one of the first things he did is he eliminated all the research groups. He just completely wiped them out. And for most people there, like I still remember very clearly all the people that I worked with, like they were all pretty happy because this was like right in the middle. This was 1997. And so it was still in the middle of the dot-com boom, and they just got jobs. Like, they were like, it's fine, we'll go somewhere else. But it wasn't totally clear what I can should do. And about that time, there was a guy named Mike Shadlin who had been a postdoc in the lab down the hall from me, who had started his own lab at University of Washington. And I knew him a little bit. I didn't know him that well. But he contacted me and he was like, you should think about coming and doing postdoc. And I remember at the time, I sort of had this list of things that absolutely needed to be true for me to even consider a postdoc. And it was kind of my way of saying, I don't want to consider a postdoc. But it had to be something that really brought together experiments and computational modeling, which for me had been separate up to that point. It had to be someone that I knew and liked. Like, I wasn't willing to take a chance on a lab that I didn't. It had to be in a place that I really wanted to live in. And I can't remember, there's a couple other things. But anyway, it was like I kept ticking those things off, and it was like, well, wait a minute. I like Mike. Seattle's pretty cool. I don't actually have anything else to do. And so I we still laugh about it. I went up to visit and I said, okay, well, it seems like this might be okay. I'll come up for a year, but then I'm going to go do something else. This short version, it's a weird short version, but this is Mike. Mike is now still one of my absolutely closest friends. It's just wonderful working with him, and I just learned so much, and I had so much fun, and things went well. And so my project there, and then a lot of luck kicks in. The project that I sort of took my time working on a project. When I finally did one, it did well, and it came out at just about the same time that Penn was looking for someone to do that kind of work. That's a really short way of saying kind of how I ended up here. But that is kind of how I ended up here. There's been lots of ups and downs since then, but I guess that's the path, and maybe that's enough of me babbling, and I'd be happy to talk about whatever things people would be interested in hearing. I can show you more pictures of my mom, and I got this whole book that my dad made, where we got all sorts of pictures of her with lots of men.
Well, maybe thanks for that, Josh, by the way. Maybe to kick it off, so could you say a little more in terms of differences between industry and academia, at least when you were working for Apple at the same time and saying, boy, I actually didn't really like grad school compared to this. And then what sort of led you to decide maybe I ought to do this postdoc instead of looking for another gig kind of in Seattle on the industry side?
Yeah, it's a good question. Part of the answer, I think, is what has motivated me to be grad group chair now. So in my grad program, there wasn't much of a program. It felt a little bit like, this is, I don't want it to sound quite as harsh as it does, but maybe I do. It was a little bit like, go into the lab, and in 5 years, if you slide your thesis under the door and it's good, we'll let you out. Like, there was a little bit of that flavor, and it was, it didn't resonate with me, and part of why Penn has been, I think, sort of satisfying for me, and that I've been so involved in graduate education, is that isn't what I think of as for our graduate program, and how our students think about it. And I think that that's important. At Apple, part of it was that I had a skewed perspective. Like, I was at Apple for, like I said, about maybe 1 day a week, and grad school the rest of the time. And so I had only a limited view there. It's very different then. It really was a research group. Like that we were never pushed to create products. Like, it really was like follow your nose. And I think for me, it just because it was pure research, and because it just kind of resonated with me, and I enjoyed what I was working on. I think that was sort of what I was thinking of it. But then when that particular group was gone, like there wasn't an obvious place. Like it had evolved, for any of you that know the history of it, it had evolved very much from Xerox PARC. And Xerox PARC was, so like if you don't know anything about the history of it, like it's amazing, like, that's where the mouse was developed. That's where like a lot of the really basic things that you take for granted with computers and computer interfaces was developed at Xerox PARC. And the Advanced Technology Group is what it was called at Apple, ATG, was really one of the offshoots of that. And by the time ATG was disbanded, there really wasn't as much of that anymore. I mean, it's funny, I say that almost all of my group ended up at Google. So when I went back to the Bay Area for a different reason, maybe 5 years ago, I went and visited them at Google, and it was like the gang, they were all there. And they were all in a research group at Google that was still, so there's still pockets of it, but I think it's a lot different pressures.
Can I ask also, so just a interesting thing about both your parents kind of being in this world sort of, and both having PhDs. Did you and your sister feel pressure from them to kind of, continue on that same path in any way? No, not at all. No,
I have a brother too. I should probably say that I have a brother, because he's going to be really mad if he ever sees this and I neglect. And he's a lovely person too. He really is. Brian can attest to that.
Hey, Josh, you didn't mention where your parents went to high school.
I didn't. That's right. I should. Yeah, maybe Brian can tell everyone the wonderful place where they went to high school that Brian knows well also.
Yeah, Bronx Science.
Bronx High School of Science. So
what year did they graduate?
Oh, that's a good question. They probably graduated. So my mom started Barnard when she was 16. She was born 41, so she must have graduated in 56.
56?
56 or 57. 57 maybe, I guess.
Okay, yeah, I graduated in 59.
59, yeah. Yeah, they were products of the New York education system. And I give them enormous credit. They didn't pressure us at all. And I think that was a big part of it. They modeled it. Brian's met them. Brian knows. And I think, and for me personally, that was a big part of sort of ending up. They were always supportive, but never overbearing about it.
So Carolyn's got a question over here.
Hi, thanks. I was wondering, since you weren't planning on having a career in academia, when you sort of returned to academia or realized you wanted to stay in academia, did you feel like there was stuff you had to catch up on, where you were sort of gaining skills that other people had already been acquiring in preparation for that kind of career?
Yeah, it's good. I never really left. So I was doing Apple and grad school in parallel. And so there was never, the ATG was disbanded probably 3 months before I graduated. And so when I finished graduate school, I think I took a month off, and then I started the postdoc. So there wasn't a gap in there. But your general question, I think of, about when do you feel like you're really prepared for a job in academia, and how do you get from here to there? Those are things that I think everyone worries about, and I worried about. I got good counseling that you're never totally prepared, and there's an awful lot of figuring it out as you go. I know that one of the themes of these sessions, that sort of front and center in the instructions that were sent to me, is about imposter syndrome. And I think it is everyone feels it. I don't know anyone that sort of managed their career such that at every point where there was a major transition in what they were going to do, they felt like, yes, I am now fully prepared to do that. There's a lot of leaps of faith, and the part that I will add to that is that it is perpetual. I've been doing this I've been here for 20 years, and I still feel it. There's still challenges. There's still lots of things that, you gain wisdom, but part of the wisdom you gain is all the things you don't know that you know that you're going to have to figure out next time they come up.
I had a question. I was wondering, as you were saying, the experience you had as a graduate student was really informed by the kind of culture there. And you said that Penn has a different culture. And I was wondering if there are any indicators or green flags that you noticed or have noticed in other organizations that might tell a person that, hey, the culture here is a supportive one.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Yeah, how do you recognize it? Where does it come from? How do you maintain it? Like, these are all things that I think about a lot. I think that I do think it's a delicate balance. Like, I think that they can be there. It can feel like it's a great culture one day and then feel like it's falling apart the next day. I think first and foremost, and this is going on right now, like literally as we speak, our recruitment is going on in NGG, and we make a huge part of our recruitment time with our students, and I think that there's no better answer to your question than whatever it is you get from the actual students that are there. Like me as grad, like I said, I've been grad chair for 10 years, which is long enough that I feel like I know, kind of how the program works. And, I've learned what are the kinds of things that'll happen. What do I need to be on the lookout for? How do I handle this when it happens? Like, those are all things that I've gained a lot of wisdom on. But the one thing that I don't know is how everyone's feeling at any given time, right? And the people whose feelings matter in terms of the graduate program are the graduate students. And so talking to them and so to find out what it's like is talking to them, but then to support them, that's a hard one. I think a huge part of it is them supporting each other. Like, I maybe this is me just being old or cynical or something. Like, the older I get, the more I feel like there's less that I personally can do to make them feel better. Like, I can solve problems. All right. If there's a specific problem, I'm really good at solving. Like, I know lots of people on campus. Like, I almost always, I know who to call. Like, I can get that done. But in terms of like students, really feeling like I'm the right person to explain kind of what they're feeling anxious about, I think the further I get away from their experience now, the less appropriate I am to be the person to kind of deal with that. And that's a long way of saying that I think a big part of it is there has to be some part of them giving that to each other. Like, they're the ones going through it. And so I think a vibrant program that's working well is one where the students are providing a lot of that for each other. And, I think we play a role in providing the substrate for that to happen and admitting students and recruiting students that fit all of that. But a big part of it is the culture that they create.
Thank you.
On the flip side, is there anything a red flag? Is there anything that you try to avoid doing as a mentor? Or you'd say that people looking, to join a lab might want to make sure that this doesn't happen here or this is avoided?
Yeah, so I used to, I guess I haven't done this in a couple of years. I used to give workshops to senior postdocs and junior faculty on mentoring. And at some point I had distilled all my slides to one slide that just said, don't be an asshole, which kind of covers it. Like it really comes down to, you need to think about the other person and not yourself. And if you do that, you're going to make mistakes, but ultimately that's the way that you're going to give support to someone. I think that's a big part of it. And I think that one of the reasons that graduate education has been successful here at Penn is that there are lots of people that recognize that in their relationships with their trainees, they need to put their trainees first. Most of the time, there's no difference between them putting their trainee first and them first, because you have aligned goals. But there are times when those don't align. And like when they don't align, it's often like at the end of grad school, like when, the obvious things that really do happen all the time, when, oh, well, that student is just now being productive. Why do I want them to leave? And the student is, yeah, I'm just being productive. It's time for me to leave. It manifests in lots of different ways, but generally, understanding that as a training program, the primary focus is the trainees. It's not what we get out of the trainees, it's what they get out of us. And having people with that in mind, I think is really important. The other thing that I've learned is that that trainee mentor relationships are very individual. So I'm very, very hesitant to label someone a lousy mentor or a lousy trainee. There's a reason that people make it to places like Penn. They have proven that they can be successful. That when they get here, they don't all of a sudden forget how to be successful. And yet, you get situations here where things aren't working. And so much of that, it's very specific to whatever's in that situation. Sometimes it's two people, like, we all know that you can have great person A, great person B, you put them together and they're a horrible pair. And that really does happen. And I feel like my primary responsibility as a grad group chair when things like that happen is to be there to support the student first of all, because they have less leverage, less power, less support network, and to make sure what I can do to put them in a situation where they can succeed. But at the same time, when I do that, I don't want there to be then a list of bad mentors that we can't send students to, because I can assure you that it's happened. I've had students come to my office and tell me in great detail all of the ways in which their mentor is the single most horrible human being they've ever met in their life and did all these horrible things. And we got the student out. And then, lo and behold, a year or two later, a student comes in the program and says, I'd really like to rotate in that lab. And I think, okay, well, you should know what it's about. You should go talk to this other student who's now in a different lab but has experience in that lab. And they go talk to the first student and they hear all of that. And then the second student says, okay, I understand that, but I still think it's a good fit. And they go and they have a great time.
Is it sort of on your theme before of kind of the students' best help coming from each other? Do you have any thoughts about how you build that kind of community where that actually happens?
Yeah, I think that's a really hard question. I think that's the kind of thing that is inertial. And we are lucky. I am lucky, for so many things in the NGG, I am lucky that the NGG was great when I started. Like I didn't have to create these cultures. I had to not ruin them. I think not ruining them is about promoting them and listening to the students and hearing from them what they think is important to support these things are all things that we do. I've thought, as thought exercises, I've thought what it would be like to start it from scratch, particularly from a place where the culture isn't there. And, certainly in this position, I talk to peers who run programs and, hear stuff. that very much seem counter to the values that I'm talking about, you know, where there's a culture that you know, the PIs value students as workers that will get things done on their grants, not as human beings who are trainees who will become scientists in their own right. And, you know, where students, you know, it's more, I think maybe the flavor that I hear the most is, and that you just want to avoid is students being afraid to be anything other than their successful selves, like afraid to that if they say something wrong, that they're, you know, something bad will happen. They won't pass their candidacy exam, that someone will hold a vendetta against them, that they have to tiptoe around, you know, praising this faculty member or they'll get angry, you know, like just kind of weird stuff like that that can happen. And like, those are the kinds of things that, like, if it was here, like, I don't know how you could go about eradicating it systematically. You know, those things get ingrained. You know, people, certainly the other thing that I have learned in this job, and this isn't a surprise to anyone that deals with human beings, pretty much everyone thinks they're a hero. Like, even when they're acting like a jackass, like they have some rationale for why they're doing it, right? It's for the greater good of whatever it is. And, you know, and so like on that level, just saying, don't be an asshole, like that's not it, that really isn't enough. Like, you know, most people genuine, like deep down believe that they are absolutely crossing that bar. And so when people don't, it becomes hard to change their ways.
Let me ask you this as well, because I understand we have a lot of undergrads who watch and who are interested in thinking about going to grad school and so on. How do you approach an undergrad who's interested or potentially interested in grad school, but they're not yet sure that this is the right path for them? I mean, especially since you've you know, are unique in also having a little bit of the experience at Apple, even though it was kind of more of a research thing. But how do you, you know, how do you balance that kind of, nowadays, sometimes you might think there's opportunity cost with going to grad school if that's not ultimately a path you're going to pursue, versus, yeah, I mean, it's a great fun thing. And if you actually want to give it a shot, you might as well give it a shot. So like, what advice would you, or how would you approach telling a student, yeah, this is a good thing for you, versus no, this isn't what you should be doing?
Yeah. Another really good question, and you know, I don't think there's an easy answer to that. I think a couple of things that I usually emphasize to students, and I've definitely had these conversations. One is to trust yourself. You know, I think that grad school is a big enough commitment that you don't want to talk yourself into it. That you know, I think once you start doing that, then you're starting to think about, you know, things that maybe aren't as central to your own motivations, but you're trying to convince yourself that they are. And, you know, like you say, it is a big enough commitment that I think that that's not effective. And so, you know, it's a big part of why it has become the case for our program and so many other programs as well, like ours, that substantial research experience is the absolute #1 prerequisite for us to even consider you to come in the program. Part of it is for us to see how well you did, but the other big part of it is to know that you've gone through the process of seeing what it's like and knowing that that's for you, because it just isn't for everyone. Like, I've had plenty of undergrads come in my lab and they, you know, look, undergrads here are awesome. They're excited and they're exciting, and they come and they tell me all the great things that they want to do, and it's great, and I'm happy to take them on. And some of them come here and like, it's great, and they just keep doing it. And some of them, it's just like after a couple of weeks, I don't see them. And it's clear, which is fine, you know, which is totally fine. I tell them that's 100% fine. But it's just clear that like, once they start doing it, it just doesn't hold their attention as much as the other thing, you know, the other great things that they have going on in their life. And so until you try it, you know, you just don't know. The other side of that too is, you know, for people who are, I guess the other flavor that I get is people that that are on the side of, they know that they really like research, but they just don't know what they're going to do with it. Like they don't, there's just so much uncertainty now about academic jobs and industry jobs, what path you take. For those people, and this is the conversation I had just today with our recruits that came in, I tell them a couple of things. Number one, I tell them I absolutely 100% think that the world is a better place with more well-trained scientists. And it doesn't matter where you end up with it. You can end up running a research lab like me. You could end up on as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Air Force, like my mom. Like it just, like there's lots of different ways that you can take it. And I think that sort of technical skills that you get, and the rigor of thinking through problems is just useful in so many places. And that, along with that, someone who's, undergrad, thinking about grad school, you're just really young too, like in a great way. Like, these things, they all have time to play out. Like what you want to do is pursue the things that mean something to you. And that's the way that you're going to figure out the path that you're going to get to, not by sort of convincing yourself based on what someone else said that this somehow will get you to a point that will somehow equal success in some vague metric.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Anne, did you want to hop in? Carrie, I saw you had a hand up too. I didn't want to miss you.
No, I was just going to ask a variation on your question, but a more mundane, I guess, nuts and bolts version. I'm still fixated on the fact that you managed to work to hold down a part-time job while doing a PhD and sort of get away with it. And would you advise that to a student trying to decide between academia and industry? Okay.
No, and you can't do that now. Like it's not like you couldn't it's not legal to get those, like you just couldn't do it now. So maybe I shouldn't have said all that. Yeah, but I mean, that said, like I tell our students all the time, it's about balancing priorities. I didn't have much of a social life. I mean, there was just a lot going on, but you just decide what it is that you value and what you want to spend time with, and try to figure out a way to balance it. That's inherent. That's absolutely inherent to grad school too. That's another part of the talk that I gave to our recruits today. That I think the big transition for most of our students is going from being incredibly awesome at getting things done that someone told you to do, to figuring out what it is that you need to do. Like that's a really, really, really hard transition. And, our students effectively have to make it in about 2 or 3 years. Like that's the trend, their first year, it's kind of like undergrad, kind of not, by their 3rd year, they're doing independent research. And like, that's the problem. That to me, that's the hard part of grad school. There's something I talk about all the time, and you in the NGG, you probably heard me talk about it. I think that one of the things that's actually gotten harder as a graduate program over the years, I think there's always truth to stereotypes. No, there isn't. There's sometimes truth to stereotypes, but I think for grad students, there's truth. Like I think the stereotypical grad student, like when I was a grad student, was pretty true, which is that it's people who kind of, as an undergrad, they kind of had their head up in the clouds. Like they really liked thinking about science or, whatever it is that they ended up in. And grad school was sort of designed to get them to focus that kind of, just what they were naturally thinking about and sort of make it more productive. I think now the idea that we need to get our incoming students to learn how to focus more is like the craziest thing that you could possibly say. Like they are so focused, and like, to me, it's a much harder, like, how do you get someone to focus less? Like, how do you get someone to get their head up in the clouds? Which honestly, I think is the real challenge of graduate school. Like, and we struggle with it. Like, I do not know the answer to that. I do know that all of the things about our graduate students that drive me insane in the first year, because they are so focused, it seems to be mostly gone by the end. So I don't know that it's because of us, but at least we don't ruin whatever transition they're having. But I really do think that's the hard.
So I was going to ask you a different question, but just because you've now said that, I want to ask you another question, which is, I think you're absolutely, I couldn't agree more that that transition from being really good at doing the sort of things that are set out for you to being able to figure out what to do is kind of the hardest part, certainly of graduate school, but maybe also just in life, right? Like to go from a sort of a place where your environment is controlled to where it's not. It's also an indicator of where I am in my thinking at the moment. I think that starts as something as an undergraduate, like there's this, you get really good at whatever it is you're doing, and then this fear of failure, this risk-taking behavior. So I guess what I want to know from you is when was a time, so it's often hard to hear, right? Like a lot of luck came into it, right? So you said during when you were talking, like, then just luck came into play, right? So instead of talking about how you got lucky, maybe I would ask you to talk a little bit about when's a time you got really unlucky, or actually just like tripped over your own feet, made your own self fall down, and how did you, circumvent that? How did you, or did you, right? When's the time you really thought, oh, I've really screwed up my life now, or just felt lost or something, and how did you get over that?
Yeah. It sounds, is this the time I should start telling stories about Yale? Like that sounds like the exact
Sure.
lead into.
Yeah. First I met Yale, and then my whole
First
life.
I met Yale, and that was, wait, which part was that? The fixing it or the, yeah. Yeah, I glossed over it. It sounded like it was easy, but like I said, I had decided I wasn't going to go to grad school. I decided that I kind of preferred the path I was going through at Apple, and then Apple disappeared. Like, that was not as easy as it sounded. Sorry, then I was go to a postdoc, and then Apple disappeared. And when I said I'd go up to Mike, like it really was like I have absolutely no idea what I'm going to do now. Like Mike seems cool, and like he seems like he'd be fine. And like it seems like I'd be fine to live up in Seattle for a year. And it really was like, I'm just going to go up there for a year because I have no idea what else I'm going to do. And then hopefully I'll figure something out. And yeah, and that was pretty scary, right? It was the time in life when, a lot of friends are getting married, right? This is sort of late 20s, sort of everyone's going through these transitions, and like these two things, like I felt like I had two possible paths, and then all of a sudden I felt like I had none. And it really was like just taking the closest thing that seemed like it wasn't going to be bad, and then being happy about how it turned out. That was really a big part of it. And again, like it doesn't change. Like I said, I've been here for 20 years, but I don't feel settled. Like I don't feel totally settled. It's a constant process of having to, I'm like getting grants. Like there are times when getting grants is good, when it's time when getting grants is bad. And there are times you think, okay, no one cares about my ideas anymore. Like what then? And at some point, I guess we all, there's a certain resignation as you get older that, all right, like, we are who we are, and we're going to take advantage of the opportunities we have, and just sort of see how it goes. And okay, it's now I need to tie it into Yale now, right? So for those who don't know, so a constant through all of this So the postdoc in the lab when I was a graduate student was Yale Cohen, who some of you may know here and may have noticed that he and I act like we've known each other for a long time. It's because we've now known each other. So how long is that? So that must have been 93. I'm guessing 93 or 94. So that was probably 28 years ago. So more than half of our lives. And so a big part of it is that you find people that you've learned to count on over the years.
I really appreciate that. I'm just thinking, piece of advice. I didn't get a lot of great advice, but I think piece of advice I got from my dad was I'd rather be lucky than, it wasn't so much advice, it was a mantra. I'd rather be lucky than smart any day. And I think I've sort of modified that for my kids, is like part of being smart is realizing when you're lucky, right? Like, and taking advantage of this, like this thing is not going to be bad. So I'll just go with it. Right.
Yeah, right. And as I told, I dog on Yale so much. I've decided I need to be nicer and say nice things. And so I actually gave a talk at a big auditory meeting a couple of weeks ago. It was all on work that Yale and I had done together. And I said something that's totally true. I said, if there's one piece of advice I can give all of the young scientists in the audience, like if you really want to be happy and productive as a scientist, find the people that you really, really like and respect the most and figure out a way to work with them. Like that really, really is so much of it. Brian, you have a question? Oh, you're muted. You can ask your question muted.
Yeah, I actually, so I guess this isn't really fair because this is more selfish. This is a question for me, but there are parts of our job that are sort of similar, but obviously I'm not faculty and not a researcher, but what do you think has been the biggest change in sort of the graduate students in the 10 years that you've been doing this? And what do you see as the biggest obstacles kind of going forward? Like for me, I'm thinking like, are we really, have we reached the point of irresponsibility where we're bringing in too many if we're not graduating them into academic careers, or do we just need to talk about all the abilities?
Oh yeah, I don't worry about that at all. Like I said, I am 100% convinced that the world is better with more trained scientists, and our graduates get jobs. Like it doesn't bother me in the least that they don't get academic jobs and whatever jobs they want. I think that's good, and they get jobs, and so I'm not worried about that. No, I think the big challenge is exactly what I said before, and I think that there are lots of ways of putting it, but I think there's something to be said about achievement and what it means and how it has crystallized more and more over the years. And I don't want to overgeneralize, but I genuinely think this is true. I think that that the sort of achievement culture has become so much more uniform in terms of how much pressure the students are under and what are the definitions of success, which becomes narrower and narrower to what I said before, that basically acing assignments. Like, that's what these students have been trained to do from earlier and earlier and pushing longer and longer. That I feel like what we're trying to do in grad school, which I was talking about before, which is kind of disavow them of some of that, is harder and harder and harder and harder. I mean, and this is part of the, again, doing this for 10 years and feeling like I'm getting a little more out of touch, and maybe it's more time for younger people to come do this that are more in tune with that. Like it's just, for me personally, it's just harder. Like I find it harder and harder to deal with the incoming students. Like they're fantastic, I love them, but just in terms of like what their needs are and what their challenges are, like the number of times that I have to explain why we think that grades aren't as important and what that means. Like, these aren't conversations that I had 10 years ago.
Yeah. I think one of the things that seems hard is it feels like students are or trainees feel pressured to achieve in a lot of different aspects of their life too. Whereas now it's almost like you have to sort of achieve in being well-rounded. And so, you know, you have to be a great scientist, but you also have to be a great mentor or mentee, but you also need to kind of exercise and like have self-care and, you know, meditate and eat a healthy diet. And it feels like a lot.
I totally agree. There's so much pressure. I 100% agree with that. And it's how do you ease that enough that allows them to be put in a position where, like I said, you kind of get your head up in the clouds. And I just mean that as like, you know, the science works when there is failure. And if it's all people that are so petrified of failure that they become paralyzed, then science stops working, right? And so it's somehow getting those two ideas, those two sides of the coin to fit together is the hard.
I you know, related to this, I've heard it said before that one of the best traits you could have in a grad student is the ability to not get bored by something, because you end up doing the same thing for a long, and you kind of touched on this as a little bit in terms of finding someone who's interested in research and they're happy to keep doing it and not give it up after a couple of weeks. Do you think that's opposed? So that idea of not being bored or like being tenacious or however you want to put it, I mean, do you think that's opposed to the head in the clouds idea? Or do you think, no, those aren't on the same, you can be both focused in the way that's required to not be bored and have your head in the clouds enough in the way that you're describing here?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think they're related. I mean, I think that I don't think the problem is being bored or not bored. My impression of you know what the challenges that a lot of grad students have isn't whether they're bored or not. It has much more to do with this: how do they deal with it when they all of a sudden come up with something that's not working? Like that really is, you know, and it's, you know, there's the sort of the professional level of it. Like, what do you do just in terms of solving the problem? But then very closely related to it, there's the personal, just how does that affect you? And those are two things those are two dimensions that really, I think, are just central to the challenge of grad school. Because as I tell students all the time, at some point you're going to hit it in a way that you haven't hit it before. And figuring out how to deal with it is a big part of it. And you know, and learning that, again, like it's, you know, it's just like Heather was saying, it's like, and like there's this meta thing of like, you know, when I raise this and learning that like dealing with that doesn't mean that you have to figure out how to deal with that perfectly. Like that becomes this sort of cascading problem. It's like, look, it's always that way. Like, you know, I get a grant not scored and it still feels like sick to my stomach. Like I haven't figured out how to not feel that way. You know, and I still cope with it in like totally immature ways, but like, you know, I won't read the reviews until like, you know, there's some time in the distant future where like everything is all fine and like I am surrounded by my children and, you know, flowers and something else and I'm in the right headspace and I'll glance at it and then I'll look away. And you know, like it's like you got to do stuff like that because a lot of it just sucks. You know, and you've got to come to some understanding in yourself of how to balance that with hopefully the good parts of it that are the things that keep you going.
Yeah, so not so much avoiding boredom, but avoiding taking the failures too hard and too personally.
Yeah. Right.
That's super interesting.
And knowing what to do next.
Yeah. Well, this was awesome. Thank you so much for doing this. We are up against the hour. You can tell your daughter we proved her wrong, that there's plenty to talk about.
I can guarantee you she won't. I'll tell her, but she won't believe it.
Well, thanks again so much for doing this, and everyone. Our next one's going to be March 3rd, which Heather just posted in the chat. So hope to see you all there too.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody.